My mother was born in Hungary, and she came here when my father went back to marry her. My father was widowed. He went back to Hungary to marry her, and then he took out my mother to America and with his other two children, with his other two daughters. And they settled on the Lower East Side. My father was always involved. I had spoken about my father previously. He was always involved in Kehillah things. He was a shamus and so on and so forth. So they came to live on the Lower East Side, and they were immigrants. They didn't have much. My father really didn't make much of a living. And my mother was always resourceful. I really didn't know what she did, but she was always selling something or buying something to sell. And my mother was a very resourceful business lady, because at home in Hungary, she was the oldest girl, and she used to help her father with his business. He had like a schmatter store, and then he also sold horses, and they did all sorts of things. And remember, in Hungary, a lot of things were not so legal, so they had to make a living in other ways. And my mother even told stories of how she went across the border to sell tobacco. And my mother would be very daring and do all sorts of things in Hungary. And she helped run the business. And she also, was very often cleaning the house. And the boys, my grandfather hired always a malamed to come to the house and to teach the boys. And while my mother was sweeping in the house, and if a boy, one of her brothers, didn't know the answer, she would scream out the answer, and then her brother would get a patch. And so she was very much into, things that are going on. My mother was a very smart lady. And when they came here, my mother also, it was at the time I was young, and I remember that my mother, the people from Europe, a lot of the men were here. This was in the 40s, and their wives were not here. They were stuck in Europe. And these were very from people, also from Hungary, and they didn't have where to eat. They wouldn't eat in anyone's house. So my mother, who was an excellent cook, which I did not inherit, my mother went ahead and had like a restaurant in her house, and she would make suppers every night. She would have about 10 people coming from, different times. Many of them didn't all come at the same time. And she would give meals to these people. So that way she also made a living, and the people appreciated that she would do it because they didn't have where to eat. They wouldn't just eat in anybody's house. Also, I wanted to mention, when I was a little girl, I remember my mother on Tishrei B'Av. My mother would sit on the floor, and she would have some from ladies coming to listen to her, and she would read from the Tzenorena, and she would cry. She would sit on a cushion on the floor, and my mother would cry. She really felt the churban. And I remember I was very upset by that, because you don't like to see a mother crying. But eventually I got used to the idea of the Tzenorena. Is a Yiddish book. It talks about everything. It talks about the Chumash. It talks about everything. It talks about Tishrei B'Av. It has it all in Yiddish. It's been translated. I even have it here. So the ladies would use that to learn from. Eventually, what happened is that the Salem Rav, who lived in Williamsburg, he called my mother, and he wanted my mother to come. And my mother, if the Salem Rav calls you, you go. And she and my father went to the Salem Rav, and he said to her, look, there's a new generation coming from Europe, and the women don't know anything. So I want you to take over the mikveh and to educate the new generation that's coming. My mother wasn't very eager to do it, but again, if the Salem Rav asks you and he feels that you're the person to do it, you do it. So we moved to Williamsburg, and my mother ran the mikveh, and with her and my father, and that's what they did. And my mother also was very active in, trying to help people, new immigrants who were coming. And she always used to get together with a friend of hers, and they used to do things. I don't know what they did, but they used to, try to find clothing and do all sorts of chesed things for the people that were coming from Europe. My mother also, we lived in a house. My father was the shamus also in that house. It was a brownstone. And in the backyard, my mother, she would grow Hashanis. And she would, with its Satmar Rebbe, came to Williamsburg. He settled in Williamsburg. And my mother was always involved with all the Rabbanim. She would go and she would plant the Hashanis in the backyard. And on Hoshana Rabbah, she would prepare the Hashanis to bring it to the Satmar Rebbe. And he would use her Hashanis on Hoshana Rabbah. And she was also friendly with the Rebbitzin, the Satmar Rebbe's wife, Alta Fega. The Rebbitzin used to come up to our house and say, Chaya Roza, there are almonas and there are yasaimim all over, and we've got to do something to help. So what they did was they would make a party or do things like that to raise money to help some yasaimim. My mother was also very much into Rabbanim. She knew all the Rabbanim. She knew, who they were. She interacted with them. She was very friendly with the Shatza rabbi and the Shatzer Rebbitzin. We used to buy our matzahs by the Shatzer. My mother would go, originally she went with my father. After my father passed away, she would take my nephew. And they would go to the Shatzer bakery. And my mother would take challah. And they would bake the matzahs for my mother right there. She was very friendly with the Rebbitzin and the rabbi. She would buy the shmura matzahs. Everybody always ate all shmura matzahs. And she would buy the matzahs for the whole family. And my mother would run to the Skver Rebbe. She would very often go to the Skver Rebbe when she had a problem. And particularly after my father passed away, she would ask Eitzes from the Skver Rebbe. Should she sell her house? Should she not sell her house? And the Skver Rebbe would answer her in a way which she felt satisfied because that's what she really wanted. She didn't want to sell the house. That's the kind. She was a very active person, and she used to, after my father passed away, she used to go to Florida in the wintertime and be there the whole winter. And even there, the Satmar Rebbe used to come for vacation. She was involved with him also, and she did things there. And she even sold a house. She was the shadchan for selling a house, and I guess she made a commission on it. So she was already older, you can imagine. Actually, she lived until she was 97. She still went to Florida until she was 96. And then we brought her home because she couldn't stay there anymore. And my brother went ahead. She lived upstairs in her house. And then, because eventually they bought a house in Williamsburg. And then he moved her downstairs where she would sit in the front, and everybody knew my mother. And they would come by and they would talk to her. Bobbi, she was called Bobbi. She came to me or to my brother for Yom Tovim. Well, she came mostly for Pesach, or sometimes she would come on Shabbos. She used to like to come here. She used to love to walk in the park. She loved flowers, and she liked davening in the shtibel because my husband used to daven at Breuer's, but then it became too hard for him to go down because he had a heart problem. And so he would go diagonally across the street where the shtibel was. And Rabbi Rita was the rabbi. He was a rabbi, and he organized that minyan. So it was Nusach Svard, which my husband really didn't daven. But when he davened for the Yomid, he davened Nusach Svard. But privately, he always davened Nusach Ashkenaz. At any rate, my mother used to like to go there because Rabbi Rita came from Hungary. And he used to sit down and talk to my mother about all the Rebbeim that were there, especially Rav Chaya at the Chris Theater. So Rabbi Rita rebuilt that whole area, and people come there. Lots of people come there because my mother knew who the Chris Theater Rebbe was. And my mother, so she would talk about him to Rabbi Rita, and he even used to come up to our house to listen to my mother talk about, the good old days. Because my mother was a lot older, My mother was always involved with Rabbanim, My father didn't run to the Rabbanim, but my mother always went to the Rabbanim, and she was involved. And they knew her from Europe also, My mother had a very, productive life. And She really was a personality. She was a personality. My nephew once said, if Bobbi would have gone to college, she would have been a CEO because she was a very good business lady too. My mother never went to seminary. She didn't have like an education, but everything she learned was from home. And she had that feeling in her for Yiddishkeit. She would go when, after my father passed away, when my father wanted to go and retire in Eretz Israel, but my mother said, no, I'm not leaving the children here. But after my father passed away, she supported a family, the Briesel family in Eretz Israel. Rabbi Briesel came to Hungary and married a relative of hers, a cousin. She was 16 years old, and she was worried she's going to Eretz Israel. Remember, this was like a long, long time ago. My mother always said to her, don't worry. I will always try to help you. And as a matter of fact, when my mother came to America, she went collecting from the people who came from Hungary, and she told them this is very important to be able to help out this family. So she went collecting for this family, and she sent money. And after my father passed away, she herself went to Eretz Israel. And I remember she took thousands of dollars in her, she had a thing around her neck. She went a few times, as a matter of fact, to Eretz Israel after my father passed away, just to visit. And she was always with this Briesel family because she bought them an apartment. They lived amongst the Arabs, and my mother felt that, you have to do something for them, and she bought them an apartment. She went there. She loved it. She used to go to Eretz Israel. She used to go to all the holy places, and she davened there. And, she was an amazing lady, very, very frum and very active and always trying to do the right thing, and also a very good business lady. So anyway, her yahrzeit was on the second day of Rosh Hashanah. Her neshama should have an aliyah, and she should be a melitz yosha for all of us, for the whole family, and for Klal Yisrael.